It was a cold winter morning in Massachusetts. At around 5 a.m., Emily Grace woke up to the sound of her mother's ragged breathing. Outside the window, tiny snowflakes danced in the light of the street lamps, attempting to envelop the world in a quiet white blanket. The small apartment room was bitterly cold. The heating had been malfunctioning since last week, and the room's temperature had been dropping day by day. Emily pulled her thin blanket closer and listened closely. Her mother's breathing sounded rougher and more strained than before. "Mommy?" The 9-year-old girl crossed the cold floor barefoot and headed to her mother's bedroom. Single mother Carol Grace had been unwell for several weeks, while continuing her late-night shifts at the factory. She had desperately suppressed her coughs. There was neither time nor money for a doctor. Last night, she seemed particularly ill, and went to bed early without touching her dinner. When Emily saw her mother, she gasped. Carol's face was pale, her forehead was sweaty, and the sheets were soaked with sweat. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, occasionally interrupted by violent coughs. "Emily." Her mother tried to open her eyes. Her voice sounded hoarse and distant. "Mommy, we need to call an ambulance," Emily said, holding her mother's hand, surprised by its heat. "No," Carol pleaded, pausing between words. "I don't want you to be taken away." Emily's heart tightened. Just last month, her school friend Sarah had been placed in a foster home after her parents lost their jobs, and she was separated from her sister. Emily still couldn't forget the sight of Sarah crying as she left the school. "But, Mommy, promise me," her mother continued, trying to catch her breath. "Don't call anyone, especially not a social worker." In the middle of her sentence, a severe coughing fit overtook her. All Emily could do was watch. She ran to the kitchen to get water and fever reducers, but her mother was almost unconscious. Then, the 2-year-old Tommy woke up in the next bed, beginning to cry anxiously. As Emily rushed to him, she noticed his cheeks were abnormally hot. Tommy coughed, and his little body shivered painfully. Outside, the snow intensified. Cold air crept through the old apartment's window frames, making the curtains eerily sway. Emily stood still, pondering her options. Her mother's warnings echoed in her head. Social workers. Foster care. Tommy's cough grew stronger, and his cries weaker. Her mother lay unconscious, her breathing irregular. Emily felt like the smallest, most powerless being in the world. But someone had to make a decision. She shakily took out Tommy's little coat. Each movement felt like an eternity. She wrapped Tommy warmly and also wrapped her mother's old blanket around him. She put on her own thin down coat and checked her wallet. Inside was a single $5 bill her mother had kept for emergencies. Emily returned to her mother, kissed her hot forehead gently. "Mommy, I'll be right back. I'm going to get help for Tommy," and then. No reply came back, only the sound of rough breathing filling the quiet room. Emily made her mother as comfortable as possible, and covered her with the remaining blankets. She was scared to take her eyes off her mother for even a moment. But Tommy was the priority now. "Let's go, Tommy." Emily held her brother tightly. There must be someone out there who can help. She reassured herself as she carefully descended the dark staircase step by step. As they stepped outside, the freezing wind mercilessly enveloped them. The snow illuminated by the streetlights felt like countless needles stinging their cheeks. Emily hugged her brother to her chest, bending over to shield his small body from the wind. Where to go? Who to ask for help? The streets before dawn were eerily quiet, normally bustling with people's voices and the sound of cars. Now the streets were ominously silent, covered in snow. On Christmas Eve's late night, the closed shop windows were decorated with colorful ornaments, but their brightness only accentuated the surrounding darkness. Only Emily's footsteps were marked step by step on the white carpet. Looking down the street, she saw a faint light in a second-floor window of a house. Clinging to hope, she walked up to the front door. "Please, open up." Emily knocked on the door, holding Tommy to her chest, waiting for a response. After a while, footsteps approached from inside. "Who is it?" An elderly woman's voice could be heard. "I'm sorry, my brother is sick." Emily tried to explain with a trembling voice. "Just a warm place for a little while." The footsteps receded, and the light quickly went out. The intention to reject was clear. Continuing down the street, she saw a pharmacy at the corner, but its shutters were firmly closed. Emily stared desperately at the medicine shelves beyond the shop window, so close yet unreachable. "Hang in there, Tommy," she whispered, rubbing her brother's back. Tommy's breathing was rough, his small body trembling. The next place she sought help was a large house with warm light leaking from the entrance. Christmas tree lights could be seen through the window. Surely, it was a warm night spent with family. Hesitantly, Emily pressed the intercom. "Yes?" A young woman's voice. "My brother is feeling ill, please." "I'm sorry." The woman answered immediately. "I can't let strangers in. Especially not at this time." Another hope disappeared. Emily continued walking, dragging her feet. There were no passing cars, no open stores. The town on Christmas Eve night seemed to shut everything out, as if to exclude them. As Emily went from house to house, her hope slowly crumbled. In one house, she could see someone moving behind the curtains, but no one responded to her call. At another house, she was threatened with, "I'll call the police." "It's cold." Tommy let out a faint cry. Emily pulled her brother's body closer to her chest. Tommy's fever was getting higher, his small body unable to stop shaking. The snow continued to fall without any sign of stopping. And now cold water had seeped into Emily's sneakers. She could barely feel her feet, and each step caused pain. But she couldn't stop. "You've done well to come this far." Emily spoke to her brother, as if reassuring herself as well. "Surely, we'll meet someone kind soon." However, the more they walked the streets, the colder the world felt, and the more distant people seemed. Behind the warmly lit windows, families were likely gathering, preparing for Christmas. But that light did not reach them. How long had they been walking since leaving the house? Snow lightly accumulating on the road signs slowly transformed the familiar streets into unfamiliar places. Emily began to lose track of where they were. All she knew for sure was that they had come quite far from the apartment where she had left her mother alone. "Mommy," she murmured unintentionally. Her mother was still suffering from the fever. She needed to return quickly. But first, Tommy. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind blew, and Emily staggered. At that moment, Tommy began to cough violently. It was the worst coughing fit he had had so far. "Are you okay, Tommy?" Emily peered desperately into her brother's face. Tommy's lips were turning blue, and he seemed to be struggling to breathe. Panic struck her. The thought of losing her brother tightened her chest with fear. Emily looked around. Somewhere, someone. Then, she heard the sound of bells carried by the wind. It was faint but clear. Emily looked in the direction of the sound. In the darkness filled with falling snow, a church steeple appeared like a shadow. When she touched the heavy wooden door, she hesitated for a moment. What if she was turned away again? But there were no other options left. Tommy's breathing was getting weaker. As Emily pushed open the door, warm air enveloped them. The quiet chords of a pipe organ resonated in the high ceiling. In the center of the church, a small wedding rehearsal was taking place. A bride in a white dress was speaking to the attendees, her profile softly illuminated by the altar lights. Emily stood frozen at the entrance, staring at the scene. It felt so surreal. Almost like a dream. But the hot feel of Tommy's body in her arms reminded her of the harsh reality. Someone. Emily's voice echoed through the church like a raspy prayer. Please, my brother. The quiet music of the pipe organ stopped, and the attendees slowly turned around. In the light pouring through the stained glass, the small, snow-dampened figures of the two emerged. Then, a woman stood up among the attendees. Dr. Margaret Winters, who was attending her sister's wedding rehearsal, seemed to instantly sense something about the children. Her graceful steps moved without hesitation from the altar towards the children. Tommy coughed weakly in Emily's arms, the sound poignantly echoing off the high ceiling. You're freezing. Margaret spoke gently but firmly as she approached them. Her gaze filled with deep compassion and sharp professional observation. Emily was at a loss for words. The rejections she had faced had hardened her heart. But there was something different in this woman's voice. My brother, he has a high fever. Emily tried to explain with a trembling voice. Her chilled lips struggled to form the words. And his cough is severe. Margaret quietly touched Tommy's forehead and watched his small chest rise and fall. Her gestures carried the assured gentleness of years of experience. It's going to be okay. She smiled reassuringly at them. I'm Margaret. I'm a doctor. I can help you. Margaret, thank you. Emily was about to sigh with relief when an unexpected word reached her ears. Let's call an ambulance, Margaret said as she took out her cell phone. No. Emily's cry echoed suddenly through the church. Her voice was filled with a determination unimaginable from her previous exhaustion. Margaret paused and looked at the girl intently. Emily hugged her brother tighter, almost as if fearing he would be taken away. Her eyes were a mix of tears and fear. But his condition is serious. Margaret tried to explain gently. He needs proper treatment. Please. Emily's voice trembled. Just, no ambulance, no police, nobody. Her mother's warning echoed in her head. Don't call anyone, I don't want you two taken away. Margaret seemed to read the complex emotions dwelling in the girl's eyes, and watched silently for a while. She sensed that there was a deep reason behind the stubbornness, not just mere obstinacy. Understood. She slowly put down the phone. Then let's go to the hospital in my car. I'll take responsibility for examining him. I won't call anyone. Emily nodded hesitantly, feeling Tommy's labored breathing. Realizing she had no other choice. Lisa, I'm sorry. Margaret turned to her sister. We need to interrupt the rehearsal. The sister in the wedding dress nodded with a gentle smile. I understand. The children's lives are more important. Margaret took off her coat and gently placed it on Emily's shoulders. My car is at the church's back entrance. Let's avoid exposing these children to the snow. As they walked through the short corridor to the back entrance, Emily kept stealing glances at Margaret's face. Could she really trust this person? Or was she breaking her promise to her mother? But Tommy's breathing was undeniably weakening. Emily had no choice but to save her brother. An old blue sedan quietly waited at the back of the church. Margaret opened the rear door, and warm air flowed out. I've had the heater on the whole time. It's a cold day, she explained as if apologizing. Sit in the back. I'll drive. Emily hesitantly climbed into the car. The softness of the seat made her involuntarily sigh. How long had they walked? Her feet were slowly regaining sensation, bringing with them a resurgence of pain. Margaret started the engine while quietly watching the two through the rearview mirror. It'll take about 15 minutes to get to the hospital. During that time, can you tell me? Why are you out alone with your brother on such a night? Emily remained silent, gently stroking Tommy's forehead. Every time the street lights illuminated the car window, her brother's pale face emerged. Understood, Margaret said quietly. No need to talk if it's hard. Let's prioritize your brother's treatment first. The car carefully made its way through the snow-covered streets. Emily gazed out the window, thinking about her mother. Was she all right? She needed to return quickly. When the hospital building came into view, Emily's body tensed with anxiety. Margaret steered away from the emergency entrance and directed the car towards the underground staff parking lot. I have my own space here. We can enter without meeting anyone. Emily showed a slight expression of relief. It felt as if Margaret had read her anxiety. The parking lot was quiet and deserted. Margaret led them through the back entrance to the pediatric ward. The corridor was dimly lit, and only the presence of night shift nurses could be felt in the distance. Here. She opened the door to the examination room. This is my private exam room. No one will come in, so you can relax. The room was warm, decorated with cheerful wallpaper for children. Margaret began preparing efficiently, hanging a stethoscope around her neck and taking out a thermometer. Let's bring down the fever first. Can you lay Tommy on the exam table? Emily hesitated. It was still frightening to let go of her brother, who was in her arms. It's okay. I'll examine him right beside you. You can stay close. Reassured by Margaret's words, Emily slowly placed her brother on the exam table. Tommy moaned softly and tried to grasp his sister's hand. Margaret's examination was gentle yet precise. She listened with her stethoscope, measured his temperature, and looked inside his throat. Throughout, she kept explaining what was happening. I'm a bit concerned about the sound of his lungs, but he should get better soon. Within 4 and antibiotics. 4. Emily's voice trembled. Don't worry. I'll use a special ointment so it won't hurt. It's a favorite method among my patients. While saying this, Margaret took a small box from the shelf. Inside were band-aids with colorful characters printed on them. Which one do you like? She seemed to ask Tommy. My recommendation is the blue dinosaur. While proceeding with the exam, Margaret felt some discrepancies. Tommy's symptoms had clearly been progressing for several days. Had he received appropriate medical care earlier, it shouldn't have gotten this bad. Emily's worn clothing and their nutritional status also worried her. Moreover, something about Emily's behavior was troubling. She was extremely afraid of ambulances and even refused to meet with hospital staff. Emily. Tommy's pneumonia has progressed quite a bit. He needs to be admitted for treatment immediately. Emily's body tensed up. But, the girl said with a trembling voice, we don't have insurance. At that moment, Margaret's cell phone rang. It was from her assistant, Jennifer. Tonight was supposed to be the most important day. For the low-income new hospital project she had been preparing for 3 years. The final meeting with the investors. Their decision would determine whether a new hospital for economically disadvantaged patients would become a reality. The presentation and financial plans were all set. Margaret stepped out of the exam room while answering the phone. But soon she was saying something unexpected. Jenny, I'm postponing tonight's final meeting with the investors. But Dr. Mr. Williams and the others are already on their way here. I know. But right now, I'm treating a serious case. These children might need immediate help beyond medical care. Doctor. Jennifer's voice trembled. You know how much effort we've put into this over the last 3 years. We've visited countless corporations to secure a slot for free medical care for low-income people. That's exactly why, Margaret replied while looking through the window back at the exam room. What we are aiming for is to save patients just like these children. Real lives are more important than plans on paper. A while later, Jennifer called again, her voice trembling. Doctor, the investors. She hesitated, searching for words. They've given up their Christmas Eve with their families to fly in from Chicago. The board has approved, and now they're really upset about the sudden cancellation. Tell them, Margaret said quietly but firmly, that I'm treating an emergency patient. As a doctor, I have no other choice. Inside the exam room, Emily watched as Margaret prepared the four, holding Tommy's hand. And watching that scene, Margaret reflected on her days since becoming a doctor. She had seen too many families unable to receive proper medical care due to financial reasons. That's why she believed creating an environment where medical care is accessible was as important as saving lives. And she had staked everything on the new hospital project. Doctor. Jennifer made one last plea. After this is over, can we reschedule? Jenny. Margaret looked her assistant in the eyes. These children need immediate help. Solving the underlying issues might take days. With that, she returned to the exam room. There was a risk the investment might be withdrawn. 3 years of effort might be for naught. But she had no doubts about her choice. Emily. Margaret spoke gently. It will take some time to treat Tommy. You can rest if you like. The girl shook her head. I'm okay. At that moment, a small noise came from Emily's stomach. Margaret thought about how long the girl must have gone without food. That's it, she said cheerfully. I'm hungry too. The hospital cafeteria is closed. But I have some emergency sandwiches in my office. Shall we eat together? Margaret's office was next to the exam room. The bookshelf was crammed with medical books, and children's drawings were pinned to the walls. The desk was covered with blueprints for the new hospital. Have a seat. Margaret pointed to a small sofa. From here, you can see how Tommy is doing, right? Emily looked through the glass window of the exam room at her brother, who was falling asleep. The only sound that broke the silence was the quiet dripping of the four Margaret took out the emergency food from the shelf. Cheese and ham sandwiches, and apple juice. I'm sorry, this is all I have. Emily hesitantly reached out her hand. But once she took a bite, her hungry body responded, and she quickly finished the sandwich. Would you like another? Margaret asked kindly, and the girl nodded shyly. As Emily ate the second sandwich, her tension gradually eased. In the warm room, it seemed she had finally found a place where she could feel safe. Emily. Margaret started speaking slowly. I don't mean to blame you. But why didn't you take Tommy to the hospital before? His condition worsened this much? The girl's hand trembled. Her fingers tightened around the sandwich. Emily faltered. Mommy is. Just then, a small coughing sound came from Tommy in the examination room. Emily immediately tried to stand up, but Margaret gently stopped her. It's okay, he's sleeping. The medicine is starting to work. Emily slowly sat back down, tears glistening in her eyes. Margaret waited silently. She did not throw out any words, instead waiting for Emily to start talking on her own. Outside the window, the snow was falling even more intensely. The clock pointed to 3 in the afternoon. The investors were probably shaking with anger by now. They had flown in all the way from Chicago to have the final meeting on Christmas Eve. But in this quiet room, what Margaret needed to face was the heart of the young girl in front of her. Emily quietly rolled up the wrapper of the sandwich that was now empty. Mommy is also sick. Emily finally began to speak in a small voice. But she's afraid of us being put into a facility. Emily looked up, her eyes a mix of anxiety and hope, as if seeking reassurance from Margaret's reaction. She's still alone at home. She has a high fever. But if we call an ambulance, Tommy and I. Her words trailed off. But Margaret could see everything: the mother's illness, the financial difficulties, and the deep love for her children. All these things were overwhelming the young girl. Emily, you've done really well. You've been alone, protecting Tommy. Tears began to fall from the girl's eyes. But you don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. Margaret continued. I want to help you, and your mother too. But the police, social workers. I will take responsibility. Margaret gently grasped Emily's hand. I won't let anyone separate you. I promise. Can you take me to where my mom is? Margaret stood up as she spoke. Let's go in my car. Emily glanced at her brother momentarily. It's okay. Margaret reassured the girl, sensing her anxiety. Tommy is stable now. And she stepped into the hallway and called out to the night nurse. Sarah, can you keep an eye on this child? I have an urgent matter to attend to. A nurse with a kind smile entered the examination room. Of course. I'll ask him what toys he wants to play with when he wakes up. Margaret took off her lab coat and changed into her coat. At that moment, her cell phone rang. It was Mr. Williams. She glanced at the screen and then switched it to silent mode. Let's go. As they rode the elevator, Emily felt the gravity of disclosing her mother's address. But in Margaret's eyes, there was something trustworthy that set her apart from other adults she had met. The car carefully navigated the snow-covered streets, following Emily's directions. How bad is your mother's condition? Margaret asked while driving. Since this morning, no, she has been coughing for a few days. Emily explained with a trembling voice. But this morning, especially, her fever was very high. I understand. Margaret nodded. When the old apartment building came into view, Emily quickly opened the car door. Here! She shouted as she ran down the snow-covered sidewalk. It's on the third floor. Margaret grabbed her medical bag and hurried after Emily. The sound of the girl's footsteps echoed as she ran up the stairs, a child's honest reaction in a desperate rush to return to her mother. As they ascended, the chill of the building seeped into their bones. The heating seemed to be completely off, and condensation was visible on the walls. This way! Emily yelled as she ran down the hallway. The inside of the apartment was colder than expected. In the faint light leaking from the window, a figure could be seen lying on the bed. Mommy! Emily immediately rushed to the bedside. Margaret also went straight to the mother's side. Her face was pale, her breathing rough. When Margaret touched her forehead, it was alarmingly hot. Carol! Emily said her mother's name. Carol Grace. Margaret quickly began her examination, placing the stethoscope and checking the pulse. Emily watched anxiously. It's likely pneumonia, Margaret said quietly. But we're on time. I'll call an ambulance. Emily stiffened. In my car. Margaret quickly corrected herself. I'll decide on hospitalization. No one will ask any unnecessary questions. At that moment, Carol opened her eyes. She looked around with unfocused eyes and murmured in a faint voice. Emily. Tommy. It's okay, Mrs. Grace. Margaret said gently. I'm Dr. Margaret Winters. Emily came to me for help. It was a very wise decision. Carol's eyes regained a bit of focus. Emily has done really well. Margaret continued. Tommy is also receiving appropriate treatment at my hospital now. His pneumonia symptoms are already calming down. It's thanks to Emily bringing him in early. Emily's cheeks turned a little red. Margaret placed her hand on the girl's shoulder, adding, You must be proud to have such a wise daughter. Carol's voice was weak, but a look of relief appeared. My children, not in a facility. Don't worry. Margaret answered firmly. I will take responsibility for treating all three of you together. For now, let's focus on your recovery. Carol showed a relieved expression at Margaret's words. Can you walk? Margaret gently asked Carol. I will support you. Carol nodded weakly. Margaret supported her body and gently helped her sit up. Emily watched anxiously. One step at a time is fine, Margaret said while supporting Carol. She held the medical bag with one arm and moved forward slowly. The stairs were particularly tense. With each step down, Carol gasped for air and occasionally coughed violently. Emily ran a few steps ahead, then stopped to look back at her mother, and ran forward again. Her actions showed the impatience typical of a child who wants to help but can't. Just a little further. The car is right there, Margaret said, feeling Carol's body gradually becoming heavier. When they reached the car, Carol was nearly unconscious. Margaret laid the back seat down to make it as flat as possible. Emily carefully placed her own coat under her mother's head. During the drive to the hospital, Margaret's cell phone rang several times. Investors, board members, reporters. She ignored all calls, focusing instead on checking Carol's condition through the rearview mirror. Upon arrival at the hospital, the emergency treatment team was already prepared. Following Margaret's instructions, the night shift medical team began working silently and efficiently. Carol was quickly taken to the examination room. Emily watched anxiously as her mother disappeared behind the door. "It's okay." Margaret placed her hand on the girl's shoulder. "We will perform all necessary tests and provide the best treatment. Meanwhile, shall we check on Tommy?" In the pediatric ward, Tommy was quietly breathing in his sleep. His small face, pale though wearing an oxygen mask, seemed a bit calmer now. The four in his arm was secured with a blue dinosaur band-aid. Emily stood quietly beside her brother's bed and held his small hand. "You did well, Tommy." At that moment, Jennifer quietly opened the door to the room. "Doctor," she said with a remorseful look, "the board is calling an emergency meeting. They want to discuss your decisions regarding this case." "I understand," Margaret replied, looking out the window. The snow was still falling heavily. "But I have no regrets." "Doctor, the test results are in." A young doctor rushed into the room, out of breath. Margaret quickly reviewed the report. Her brow furrowed at the critical values listed. "We need an ICU bed." "Yes, it's already being prepared." The doctor hesitated slightly. "But about the costs?" "Tell them I will handle all treatments based on my judgment." Margaret spoke in a calm yet firm voice. Emily, still holding Tommy's hand, looked uneasily at the adults talking. "Don't worry." Margaret smiled at the girl. "I will take responsibility for the treatment of both your mother and Tommy." Outside the window, the snow continued to fall quietly. Christmas Eve night was deepening. In the pediatric wardroom, Tommy breathed peacefully in his sleep, and Emily, exhausted. On Christmas morning, Margaret arrived at the hospital early. There was an email from the board on her cell phone. They were calling a meeting in the afternoon to discuss the emergency treatment decisions made the night before. However, she first headed to the ICU. Carol's condition had significantly improved overnight. She was conscious and even managed a faint smile under the oxygen mask. "How are Emily and Tommy?" Carol's voice was weak but filled with a mother's concern. "They are both fine," Margaret answered while examining her. "Tommy's fever is decreasing, and Emily has been with him the whole time." Heading to the pediatric ward, Emily was already awake. She stood by the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. "Merry Christmas." Margaret greeted her, and the girl turned around, showing a bright smile for the first time. "Doctor, how is Mommy?" "She's getting better. You'll be able to see her soon." The hospital corridors were decorated for Christmas. Nurses were handing out gifts to the children in the pediatric ward. A red stocking was hung next to Tommy's bed. Before heading to the afternoon board meeting, Margaret checked on Carol one more time. Her vitals were stable, and her oxygen saturation had improved. Her medical judgment had been correct. It had been a race against time. Entering the conference room, she was met with stern looks from the board members. During the 3-hour interrogation, Margaret explained her decisions calmly but resolutely. The new hospital was an important dream, but saving lives in front of her was her absolute mission as a doctor. Returning to the room after the meeting, she was greeted by an unexpected scene. Tommy had woken up, and Emily was gently talking to him. The oxygen mask was off, and his voice, calling his sister's name, was heard faintly. "Doctor." Emily turned around happily. Tommy woke up. Outside, large snowflakes continued to dance quietly. Christmas evening was gently coloring the hospital windows. In the following days, Tommy and Carol's recovery exceeded the doctor's expectations. Tommy was freed from the oxygen mask and began to regain his energetic voice little by little. Carol moved from the ICU to a regular room, and finally, the three family members could stay in the same room. The heavy burden gradually lifted from Emily's shoulders. With her mother and brother's recovery, her youthful brightness returned. As the new year approached, their discharge day was drawing near. After Margaret finished her rounds and moved on to the next room, Nurse Mary came in to change the four. "It's really wonderful," Mary said while checking the four, her face soft with a smile. That night, everyone was at a loss. An emergency patient without insurance. But the doctor didn't hesitate for a moment. "What do you mean?" Carol asked quietly. "Well, you see. On Christmas Eve night, the doctor gave up her important new hospital project to save your lives." Carol's eyes widened in surprise. Emily also looked up from her book, listening intently to the nurse's words. "Didn't you know?" Dr. Winters had been preparing a new hospital plan for years. It was for patients who are economically disadvantaged. Mary continued while adjusting the four. "That night, there was a crucial meeting with investors. But the doctor prioritized treating you." "And what happened to that plan?" Carol's voice trembled. "It seems all the investors withdrew their investment," Mary said quietly. "A plan that took 3 years to prepare, gone overnight. But the doctor has never shown any regret." Tommy was sleeping peacefully in the bed, his calm breathing filling the room. Carol couldn't hold back her tears. Emily clutched her mother's hand tightly. "For us." "Yes, but listen." Mary smiled gently. "The doctor always says, one life is more important than any plan." Seeing a sense of guilt beginning to appear on Carol's face, Mary quickly added, "This is the doctor's pride. As a physician, saving the life of the patient in front of her. That's her conviction. All of us staff deeply respect her decision." Mary looked at Tommy's sleeping face and smiled. Seeing his smile, "I truly believe that the doctor's decision was correct. A large hospital is important, but saving each individual life is the true mission of us healthcare workers." Emily listened silently, her eyes filled with understanding. She was recalling her own decision. That moment on that night when she risked everything to protect Tommy. "We need to thank the doctor," Carol said quietly. "Yes, but you know." Mary laughed brightly. "What the doctor would be most pleased about is that you are all getting better. That's enough for her, I'm sure." That evening when Margaret came for her last rounds, she noticed a slight change in the atmosphere of the room. There was a deeper sense of gratitude in Carol and Emily's eyes. "You're being discharged tomorrow," Margaret said while placing a stethoscope on Tommy's chest. "Your recovery has been very smooth, Doctor," Carol called out quietly. "Thank you for saving us on Christmas Eve night. I heard that you gave up an important plan for us." "I'm really sorry." Margaret couldn't help but smile. "Don't worry about it. As a doctor, it was the natural choice to make." "But, hey," Margaret gently interrupted. "More importantly, how about after discharge? Everything okay?" Carol momentarily looked down. "Well, I've been thinking about finding a job. And about the medical bills." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Could I possibly work at this hospital? Cleaning, serving, anything." "Huh? Cleaning, serving meals, anything really." Carol's voice was filled with determination. I want to work and give back little by little. Margaret couldn't help but smile. Actually, I've been thinking about it. There's an opening for a counselor in the pediatric care department. But I don't have any qualifications. You have an experience that no one can match. The experience of a mother who fought to protect her children. Outside the window, the evening was quietly approaching. A counselor. Carol repeated the words, a mix of surprise and hope on her face. Yes. A job where you listen to mothers in difficult situations. And think about solutions together. You can truly empathize and provide support. Emily's eyes sparkled. Mommy, that's wonderful. Tommy, too, reacted to his sister's voice and woke up. Mommy's job? Let's start with training. Margaret said. I will supervise you directly. We couldn't build a large hospital. But personalized medical care, that's my new dream. Carol nodded deeply. Tears streamed down her cheeks. But they were no longer tears of fear or anxiety. Doctor. Emily suddenly stood up, taking out a folded piece of drawing paper from beside her pillow. Could you look at this? It was a picture Emily had drawn during her stay. A church under falling snow. A blue car instead of an ambulance, and in the center, a woman doctor in a white coat. Titled My Christmas Angel, in childlike handwriting. Margaret gasped. The picture vividly depicted memories of that night. The relentless snow, the stained glass of the church. And the figure of a girl desperately hugging her sister. There's something on the back too, Emily said, a bit shyly. The back had a letter written in a child's hand. Thank you for saving Tommy, Mommy, and me. You are like a real angel. When I grow up, I want to help people in trouble, just like you. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes. The new hospital might have been lost. But the truth depicted in this picture felt infinitely more precious. Emily. Margaret gazed tenderly at the drawing. I want everyone to see this. Really? Emily asked, slightly embarrassed. Of course. But not just in the hallway. I have a more special place in mind. The next day, as preparations for discharge were finalized, Margaret led the family to her office. There, Emily's drawing was already framed and displayed on the wall. This drawing has taught me, Margaret said while standing by the window, that sometimes a small step can start a great change. I want to turn this office into a place of new hope. On the shelf by the window, a new nameplate was placed. Under the words Child Support Counselor, Carol's name was written. Let's start training next week, Margaret said. It might be hard at first, but let's work hard together. Doctor. Carol began to speak, but Margaret gently shook her head. Call me Margaret. We're colleagues now. Tommy had already fully recovered, curiously wandering around the office. Emily stood proudly in front of her drawing. Then, there was a knock at the door. It was one of the board members. Dr. Johnson, an elderly physician. Excuse me. Dr. Johnson entered the room. At over 80 years old, he was a senior figure who had served at the hospital for more than 50 years. Dr. Winters, may I have a word? He looked around the room and his eyes landed on a painting on the wall. It's a painting I made, Emily answered, a bit nervously. Dr. Johnson stood in front of the painting, absorbed in it for a while. Eventually, he turned slowly towards Margaret. I'd like to make a new proposal at the board meeting. The old doctor's voice was calm. even if a large new hospital is not feasible. There are things we can start right from this examination room. I'd like to allocate my legacy fund for a small-scale pediatric care program. Margaret's eyes widened. I've always been watching. Dr. Johnson continued. How you face each patient individually. That's more fitting to our hospital's philosophy than the investor's plans. Outside the window, light snow began to fall. The light of New Year's morning gently entered the examination room. A few weeks after Carol and her family were discharged, in mid-February, Margaret's new initiative began. It started with just a few hours of training once a week. Carol would send her children off to school and then head to the hospital to slowly progress through her training as a counselor. That's the way, Carol. Your words carry weight. You have a warmth that only someone who has overcome suffering can understand. Thank you, Margaret. I will do my best. Her initially nervous voice grew increasingly confident with Margaret's encouragement. Realizing that my experience can help others. That recognition had kindled a new light in Carol's eyes. Then, one day, a young mother visited the counseling room softened by the gentle spring sunlight. Overwhelmed by medical expenses, she expressed that she was at her limit, but Carol spoke to her calmly. I started from the same place too. But there's a way to not have to bear it all alone. Let's think it through together. As the mother left, a bit of the weight seemed to have lifted from her expression. Outside the room, Margaret watched with a gentle smile. Emily began stopping by the hospital after school, always bringing coloring books, crayons, and card games. Her arrival in the pediatric ward's playroom was always met with cheers. Big sister Emily. What are we playing today? Eliza, a girl in a wheelchair, usually sat by the window reading a book. At first, she kept to herself, but as Emily continued to gently speak to her, she gradually opened up. It's really worrying when a family member is sick. One day, Emily started a conversation with Eliza while folding paper craft. But there are lots of kind people here, like Dr. Winters. For the first time, Eliza smiled, a sight that made the nurses smile too. Next to them, 6-year-old Mike was scared of his 4. Emily spoke to him gently. My little brother was scared at first too. But look, if you're brave, you get a blue dinosaur band-aid. Mike's eyes lit up. I want the dinosaur too. Showing a positive response to his treatment for the first time. When Emily comes, the children's faces light up. The nurses at the station talked among themselves. Because she has taken care of her brother, she understands the patient's feelings. Emily became known as the little counselor among the staff naturally. Tommy's fever had long since subsided, and his regular checkups brought smiles to everyone in the hospital. To the trainee doctor who tried to apply a cold stethoscope, he playfully warned, "Doctor, that's cold," eliciting laughs from the surrounding staff. One Christmas, a year later. In the evening twilight with snowflakes swirling, the hospital lobby was illuminated by a large Christmas tree. The pediatric ward's Christmas party was filled with smiling faces. Look, Tommy, here's your present. Emily led her fully recovered brother towards a hospital staff member dressed as Santa Claus. His cheeks were flushed with the excitement of Christmas, a stark contrast to the previous year. Carol was still in the counseling room, talking to the family of a new patient. The expressions of those listening to her slowly regained colors of hope. It's really a wonderful change. Margaret observed the party from the office window. On the wall, Emily's drawing was still displayed. Memories of that Christmas Eve night. Her decision that night was not wrong. At that moment, Margaret's phone rang. It was a call from a medical foundation. Listening to the content, a new light sparked in her eyes. The news on the phone far exceeded Margaret's expectations. A medical foundation had expressed deep interest in her activities. They had been observing the hospital's efforts for several months. The personalized, family-centered care she provided was exactly what they had been seeking for a long time. A new hospital proposal? This time with much better conditions than the previous investors had offered. After hanging up, Margaret stood by the window for a while, as if fate had played a trick. By giving up her important plan that night, a door to a much larger dream had begun to open. And it all started with meeting Carol, Emily, and Tommy. Without them, Margaret might never have realized what was truly important. Towards the end of the party, Margaret called Carol over to share the good news. Tears appeared in Carol's eyes. Really? Oh, that's wonderful. I've felt so guilty. You really didn't need to worry. Look, because we met you. Such a wonderful offer has come our way. Margaret smiled, and Carol, tearful yet smiling, responded, Mommy. At that moment, Emily rushed into the counseling room, followed by Tommy running behind her. Santa gave us all presents. Margaret watched the children's smiling faces and felt a deep gratitude in her heart. Their meeting a year ago had significantly changed her life, teaching her the true weight of each individual life. And now, a new door was opening. A bigger dream. But it was not the cold, impersonal plan of before. It was a place that stayed close to people's hearts. A gathering place for those who never lose hope even in tough times. Everyone. Margaret looked at the families. Being able to spend Christmas together like this is the best gift for me. The snow continued to fall quietly. The lights on the tree by the window softly illuminated the room. In the hospital lobby, still resonating with the Christmas party's afterglow, Tommy suddenly tugged on the hem of Margaret's white coat. Doctor, listen. He carefully handed her a paper bag. We all made this. Inside was a handmade Christmas card. Emily's drawing, words of gratitude written by Carol, and a heart drawn with Tommy's red crayon. Margaret reflected on the past year. Sometimes the journey seemed circuitous, but it all led to this moment of happiness. The new hospital would surely start from these bonds. As they were leaving, Emily stood by the window of the examination room, looking outside. Hey, doctor. The snow is beautiful. Yes, it really is. Together, they watched the snow piling up, sharing a quiet happiness. The snowflakes, like angel wings, gently illuminated the door to new dreams.